people still are interrupted by instant messages, Slack, etc., on an average of something like 200 times per day.
What if we think about how we use our free time first before we attack the business case?
That's a great way of thinking about it.
Could that be the key to the shorter workday?
There is a real sustained hunger to rethink the place of work on our lives, to rethink time, and to find new ways of working that allow us to do good work without having it destroy us.
Welcome to 5 Hour Formula. I'm Alex Gafford. Based on my personal experience of working 5-hour workdays since 2016, I'll help you learn how to get more done in less time while reinvesting the freed up time into what truly matters most to you. Today's interview is with author, consultant, and futurist Alex Soojung-Kim Pang. It's part of a new series where I'll be talking with experts who are reimagining the way we work around the world. Alex studies and writes about the future of work. I'll dive into some of his influential books like Rest, Shorter, and The Distraction Addiction. I consider Alex one of the world's leading voices on the shorter work week, as well as the relationship between productivity and rest. I hope you enjoy the discussion. Let's jump in. Well, Alex, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks very much. It's great to see you again.
I was racking my brain on how we were originally connected. Obviously, the last time we spoke, we were collaborating around the 4-day week global community. And then before that, you were talking to me about our 5-hour workday story for your research for your book, Shorter.
Right. Yeah. No,
That's kind of the backstory on how we're connected. And before we dig in, I've got a lot of great questions for you today. And I just wanted to let you know how grateful we are for your work, because we were one of those kind of pre-pandemic experiments, 5-hour workday, where there were times, and we're in the finance industry. So there were times where people were like telling us that we were or thought we were crazy for working 25-hour weeks. And sometimes we were starting to kind of believe that, or sometimes there were just times where I think your work really helped ground us, where we were like, does this really make sense to keep this thing going? And now post-pandemic, it's kind of people have a different mindset, right?
Absolutely. I think that for me, when I was researching Shorter, that Blue Street was a really interesting case study, partly because, like many other companies I eventually discovered, you're in an industry that isn't known for sort of relaxed attitudes and short hours. And the fact that you were able to do that was, a signal that there are lots of other hard-charging industries with, high standards, big client demand, short deadlines that maybe ought to take this seriously as well. So I owe just as much to Blue Street as you guys do to me as an inspiration.
You were able to find so many companies in that book, Shorter. I think it was over 100 companies, right, that you interviewed and featured in the book.
Yeah, and this was pre-pandemic. So all over the world.
Before the 4-day blew up.
Exactly.
Before it became really popular.
Right. And these already were industries or companies in all kinds of different industries. So there were, law firms, manufacturing, lots of professional services. So, the 4-day week already was not just companies that were very into work-life balance and lifestyle oriented, but these were, places in industries where, overwork is the norm, and that were usually trying to solve really basic existential issues that lots of companies face, right? Questions around work-life balance and founder burnout, and figuring out how to build a culture that won't destroy its people, but still deliver great results to clients. And, so the fact that from the beginning, this was a movement that you could see popping up in places like the tech industry and financial services struck me as a really important really important thing that suggested that this was not just going to be a flash in the pan, but was sort of a movement that was going to have legs and going to go in interesting places.
Because the motivation for making the switch, there were real serious challenges that they were using the shorter work week to overcome. Like for us, it was retention.
Right.
We couldn't afford these massive compensation packages that Apple Finance and all these other companies could afford. So we said, well, we can't pay those massive compensation packages, but we can give people their time back.
Right.
So for us, it was retention and recruiting. For others, it was serious burnout, which we see in our industry. You know, it's serious. I mean, like it is common that people in our industry will boast of working 60 plus hours. I talked to a guy that not too long ago, I was talking to a client that said that he had 50 meetings that week.
Wow.
It just blew my mind.
Yeah.
So going back to researching all these companies, what is really interesting to me is how did you find these companies? Like, how did you track them down? Because I know we weren't advertising this, and a lot of companies weren't advertising it because they didn't want people to think that they were like, I don't know, slacking off. Like everyone was kind of looking at it as an experiment prior to 2020 or prior to the pandemic. It was like an unproven experiment, if you will. So how did you find so many companies?
It was a challenge. It was a lot of Googling around. And, fortunately, I think David had written something about the experience at Blue Street Capital. But it's, it was, but a lot of it was once you find a company, interviewing people, asking them, who has called you and tried this for themselves. So, especially in the early days, there were plenty of organizations that were doing it because they had heard from other founders.
You just followed the thread.
And you follow the thread. But even today, I am still finding companies, whether it's through Google searches or LinkedIn or word of mouth, that have been doing this for 3 or 4 years. And even I hadn't heard of them before. And so it is a continual source, fortunately, more of pleasure than frustration, that, that someone who looks constantly for these companies is still discovering ones that have been doing this for a while. So.
And some of these are not small companies. Like what were some of the larger companies that you've interviewed and written about?
Yeah, so many of the biggest ones are in Asia, interestingly, in Japan and Korea, which are two places that you don't think of as very attuned to work-life balance because they're not. But
they're like our finance industry,
right?
Their whole economy,
exactly,
work culture.
And precisely for those reasons, you've got a whole bunch of companies that are pushing back against the prevailing work culture and trying a 4-day week as a way of dealing with those burnout and retention and work-life balance issues.
And there's literally a word, right? Work yourself to death. What's that Korean word?
The Korean word is gwarosa, I believe. And then, karoshi, of course, is the Japanese word.
The Japanese word too. Okay.
Yeah, I think
it's wild.
I think so far those are the only two languages that have had to invent words for working yourself to death. But but it is a remarkable little signal of just how pervasive overwork is there. But the companies there, I think the largest one was about 1,000 people or so. And, they either had moved everybody to a 4-day week, or a 4-day week was something that a couple divisions had or were available as part of a broader kind of style of flexible work. I think that, and while it is a movement that's still large, mainly small and medium-sized companies, because, in a company of, let's say, 20 people, you still often have the original founding team who can say, we're going to try this crazy sounding thing. And they kind of have the moral authority or juice to do it.
Right. It keeps the experiment going too. I mean, like we still frame it as an experiment. We've been doing this for almost 10 years.
Yeah, I think everybody where it lasts, it's forever an experiment because you don't want it to turn into just another entitlement that everybody takes for granted. And it is always the case that there are things that you've got to do in order to earn that free time. But I think the upside is that, there are a lot of good things that come when you think of the 4-day week or other parts of your business as experimental, right? And you're willing to try new things, to sort of treat this not as something that's fixed in stone, but rather something that you need to or have the power to continually update and improve and tweak. And so I think that on balance, the benefits to the organization and to workers of thinking of this as sort of an experiment rather than an entitlement are pretty positive.
Yeah, no, and I always thought of the 5-hour workday itself, like that initial experiment was kind of the trigger that changed the way I thought about work and life even. So it started with work. I'm going to start experimenting with time blocking and taking breaks, and your book Rest was a huge part of that. We read that as, I don't know if you knew this, but we read that as a company book club
Wow.
book. Rest years ago. And it's become some of the things we learned in that book about taking like intentional breaks in the middle of the day, taking a walk. That's part of our company culture. So if you go to Blue Street, the first hour and a half, everyone's going to be head down, dead quiet. No one's interrupting each other. And then everybody just leaves. Everybody just walks out the door and goes for a walk in Southern California. The weather's always sweet.
That's fabulous.
Yeah. But the point I was going to make is like, that was kind of the trigger that changed the way that we thought. I wish that it was a faster process. And I know it's probably frustrating for business leaders where they can make some changes, right? They'll change maybe the structure of how they do meetings and some fundamental changes. But I think it's frustrating because it's really on each individual to kind of change the way they work. At least for our example, is a 5-hour workday is pretty heavy lift from 40. It was on us really to innovate.
Yeah, I think that the good news about that though is that in an organization that's moving to a shorter work week, you're not just doing it completely by yourself, right? We all have a high degree of personal responsibility in a trial, but the way it works in just about any other kind of organization is if you have work-life balance issues, you're trying to figure out flexible work, you're on your own, right? There may be a program that gives you formal permission to do that, but figuring out the details is something that you've got to do for yourself, more or less in isolation. And I think one of the powerful things about 4-day week companies or companies like Blue Street is that by making this something that everybody does, from the founder down to the newest employee who's passed their preliminary trial phase, that this is something that everybody creates together. And so, while just as in a sports team, you are responsible for your own position, you're not playing by yourself.
That's a great analogy. And then the coach, the leader, the founder, the CEO, whoever it is, you would recommend that they also model the shorter work week.
Oh yeah, you always look to the boss to see whether this thing is really serious or not. And so, if a founder, a CEO wants this thing to succeed, they've got to do it themselves. And often, honestly, they will implement it for everybody so that they can do it and so that they'll be held accountable.
Yeah, you got that from Dave, I'm sure. When you talk to him, he loves to surf. So he's like, I honestly, selfishly want to be surfing in the afternoon, and I'll feel a lot less guilty if my people are out there, surfing with me, if you will.
Absolutely.
So I just love that perspective. Now, going back to that thread we talked about earlier, you were kind of pulling the thread. This company said, well, we learned about it from this company. Dave said, well, we learned about it from tower paddle boards, or so on and so forth. What was your initial thread from your research? Because you wrote another book that I've read that I think is fantastic and very applicable is The Distraction Addiction. With just the name of it, you can obviously see how that is very applicable. Distractions don't have much of a place in a shorter workday, certainly not a 5-hour workday. And then rest, which we read as a book club, book as a company, and used a lot of great takeaways from that. How did that evolve into the shorter workday? Did you just stumble upon a 4-day week company? Was it an individual?
It was this is a trilogy of books that I did not set out to write as a trilogy, that are all connected in ways that I only recognized in retrospect. So distraction addiction is about the ways in which our technologies serve to try and chop up and remix and resell our attention, and how we can use our devices, software, et cetera, to help us be more focused and mindful rather than perpetually distracted. And this is a huge issue in the workplace, right? The most recent research tells us that people still are interrupted by instant messages, Slack, et cetera, on an average of something like 200 times per day, which is just ridiculous. So that book was about how you deal with all of that. Rest was kind of the flip side. If distraction addiction was about the importance of focus and mindfulness in the workplace, of deep attention, rest was about the importance of sort of leisure and free time in helping people do really great work. And then shorter was sort of scaling that up, asking how is it that organizations are able to put those lessons into practice for sort of everybody. And it turns out that basically the same things that you do in order to sort of get more rest in the workplace, to achieve, to implement a 4-day week, are also things that you've got to do in order to solve the distraction problem, right? So, the things like making meetings shorter, and especially giving everybody time for deep work during the day, where you can be a little antisocial. You don't talk to other people. You don't have to answer the phone. You can just focus on stuff that really, sort of really matters to you and sort of matters to to your job. These are all things, it turns out, that organizations can do that solve, that give people more rest by creating the circumstances that allow them to focus and be more productive.
Yeah, that's really well framed, because the distraction addiction is that's where people tend to spend all their effort optimizing productivity and efficiency and performance. And then you're kind of shifting gears to rest. And we've kind of adopted this mindset that without rest, we don't get that peak mental performance. We don't get peak creativity. That was the big takeaways for us. And so we built in these rhythms where we have hour and a half deep work time blocks or call blocks or whatever that intense work is, followed by 10, 15, 20 minutes of deep rest. Deep rest, meaning like no cell phone, no technology, like a walk in nature, ideally, something like that. And the way I even like to think of it is, because I train for Spartan races, these are like obstacle course races, and it gets very intense as I get up, close to a race. My training will be more intense. My recovery becomes more intense. So like I'm kind of using that mindset that I use for work and rest with training and rest. And I think a lot of your research indicated that it's an interconnected system.
Right. Yeah, it is interconnected both kind of mentally or physiologically, in the sense that, when you're training for a race, for example, there are sort of things that you will, strategies maybe that you'll develop that sort of consolidate mentally when you're resting. Likewise, you build muscle when you're asleep, not when you're actually sort of at the gym. So you can't, you can't build muscle just by sleeping, but you need both in order to, get long-term benefit.
Yep,
Yeah,
it's a critical step that can't be missed. And
exactly.
yes, I take my sleep even more seriously during that period of time. I work
Good.
those, PM protocols. Okay, so I want to talk about this book, Rest. One chapter specifically is titled 4 Hours.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably my favorite chapter of any book related to the shorter work week because this chapter, 4 hours, is this not the case for a 5-hour workday?
So the chapter argues that when you look at the daily schedules of incredibly productive people, right? Composers, famous scientists, mathematicians, writers.
Yeah, you use Darwin and Dickens and all these world famous people worked 4 to 5 hours.
Yeah, 4 to 5 hours a day. Now, that's 4 or 5 hours of really deep work, highly engaged, close the door, no telephones for most of them. They, didn't even exist yet. Right. So, how many Darwins have been, have just been distracted by TikTok in the last 10 years. But, it turns out that 4 to 5 hour of ceiling is one that you observe over and over again in the daily schedules of super creative people. And there's also some research on attention that tells us that really functionally is about as much time as we have every day for really, really focused work. And so so what that tells us is that if you can eliminate other distractions, make meetings as short as possible, etc., then you can actually do a lot of really great stuff in those 4 or 5 hours. Seeing that pattern so consistently across so many different lives was, for me, one of the things when I was researching Rest that told me there really is a story here that's worth telling that people people need to hear.
Yeah. I mean, it just jumps off the pages. And then also, I love that you looked at that very famous research from Anders Ericsson, the 10,000. Everybody talks. I mean,
Right.
I can't tell you how many personal development books I've read on productivity that reference the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice.
Yep.
And probably one of the most famous one was it Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers? And you point out like, a lot of these books, they overlook some pretty critical things. And kind of what were those main things that were overlooked in that research that everyone focuses on the 10,000 hours and the productivity, the efficiency?
Yeah. I think there were two things really to keep in mind about this. One is that this is 10,000 hours over a decade, right? So if you assume that even world-class violinists go on vacation and they take some weekends off, let's assume that's 250 days per year. So 2,500 days, 10,000 hours, that works out to practicing for 4 hours a day. And that's, again, that magic number, 4 hours. So the other thing about the Ericsson study is that Ericsson didn't just look at how many hours people practiced. He also looked at the other ways in which people spend their time, right? How much time they spend doing leisure things and hobbies, how much time they spend sleeping. And what he found was that the top performers, the 10,000 hours folks, did not spend as much time on hobbies as some of their classmates, but they were more thoughtful about what they chose, first off. And second, that they actually slept more than people who were practicing, 8 or 10 hours a day. Partly, they had good sleep discipline at night, but they also often took naps during the daytime. And so what we saw was that it wasn't just the 10,000 hours of deliberate practice that made people great. It was also about 12,500 hours in the same span of sort of deliberate rest and about 30,000 hours of sleep. And all three of those, exactly, And all three of those turned out to be critical.
And so it's going back to that same theme. It's like they're taking their rest very seriously, just like they're taking their deliberate practice, if we're using that study, very seriously. And we can do that in work, right? So we can have these time blocks and have deliberate, focused, intense work if we have the mindset that we take that same intentionality around rest and sleep. That's a pretty good recipe for success for a shorter work week.
Yeah. You mentioned something that Blue Street does, and that I also see in the people I talk about in Rest and in other 4-day week companies, which is this habit of layering these periods of sort of deep work and deliberate rest. So, working hard for 90 minutes, then immediately taking a break, and then maybe going into another period of deep work sometimes at some places. And this is important because there can be a real creative charge that you get from that downtime. And it is sort of magnified if you sort of do this kind of layering, because, you think about, you're working on a problem and it might have a lot of different moving parts. And when you take a break, they're all still kind of running around in short-term memory, which means that you go out for a walk, do some gardening, something else. All that stuff is still kind of in the back of your mind, and your creative subconscious is still thinking about it, still processing it, even while your conscious attention is somewhere else. And it is, and so uh, so if you have that kind of schedule, it means that not only are you, giving your eyes a chance to look into the middle distance rather than at screens, and you're getting up and getting a little motion, but you also, you also increase the odds that you're going to solve some problem that's been bothering you at work a little faster than you would otherwise, because even as you rest, this other part of your mind, what neuroscientists call the default mode network, is going to be working on this problem while while your attention is sort of elsewhere, and making progress while you rest. So that is this. It's a practice that I see people discovering over and over again, and it's really interesting to see that lots of organizations that adopt shorter hours also fall into that pattern as well, whether they've read Rest like Blue Street, or whether they just discover it on their own.
Yeah, there's a lot of good research coming out about that. And I also think about comparing that to like Overwork, because you kind of lose that phenomenon of getting that creativity boost and kind of energized in the office. Like, I feel very energized during these time blocks, even though they're sometimes intense. And then I'm taking that break. I'm thinking about when we were working 8, 9, in the finance industry, people work 12-hour days or more. So they lose, like if they take a break, it's more, they're already innervated too much, I feel like, for their brains to get that. And I think we talked about that in that, the 10,000 hour study. Like the violinists that were practicing like 8 hours a day were not making the same strides as the ones that were doing 4.
Right. Yeah.
Focus. So there's some magic in kind of condensing these days, I feel like.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And there is a kind of virtuous circle, right? Sort of that, sort of the better your day is designed, the better you're able to choose forms of rest that are more restorative rather than less, right? You've got, in a sense, you need some minimum amount of energy or decision-making ability left to, go for the run rather than sit on the couch. And over the long run, the first is going to be much better for you and actually more restorative and restful than the second. Right? Doing things that are physically engaging, that are effortlessly mentally engaging or challenging in ways that keep you from thinking about work, actually deliver more of a restorative boost than than things that are kind of mindless. And but unless you've got someone who is like going running with you, or some other kind of structure that forces you to do that without thinking, making that choice is still something that requires a little bit of energy. And that's harder to do if you've been working a 12-hour day than if you're working a 5-hour day.
Yeah, you have no willpower. Yeah, because I'm a believer in that willpower does run out like a battery. But you can improve your willpower skill, your decision-making abilities, the more you continue to spiral up with this pattern of taking breaks, getting good sleep. Rest is really critical. It's almost counterintuitive when you get into the book Rest and you start talking about the high activity stuff, where even sometimes I'm primed to be at my top mental performance when I'm also a physical peak performance, when I'm doing things that are exhausting physically, training for these races. But that's sometimes when my mind, like when I'm able to come up with the best ideas, not just laying on a couch or, some other, what you think of when you think rest doesn't necessarily mean rest, laying down, taking a nap. It can mean that, but it can also mean these other types. It's counterintuitive to many people.
Yeah.
So,
no, I think that there, certainly the kind of downtime where, you're on the couch with a sort of a TV remote in one hand and a bag of snacks in the other, that's got its place, but it's not the only kind of rest that we should shoot for. And
it takes both.
Right. And especially for people who are accustomed to being, kind of always on, always active, it can be difficult to kind of downshift. And so having something that is, mentally engaging and physically challenging, but also delivers restorative benefit is, can often feel like something that is sort of easier for them to do or to work into their lives than something that is more passive. And over the long run, doing these more active things will also help us be better at work, because even those of us who are mainly sitting at desks looking at screens, engaged in cognitive activity, that actually requires a lot of a lot of energy. We underestimate how much our brains demand, and so the better physical shape you're in, right, the better your cardiovascular health, or the better your brain is going to be able to perform. And so there is a deep connection between sort of being in good physical condition and being able to do good cognitive or creative or professional work that I think we would all, we should all recognize in our own lives.
Yeah, I mean, we'll tell people the 5-hour workday is exhausting. Like it's hard. It's counterintuitive. And that we take breaks in between. Most people are like, you take breaks? How do you have time to take breaks? You only work 5 hours. It's counterintuitive, but it's a critical component. I wanted to shift gears into discussing, just for a little while, design thinking. So I loved how you structured the book shorter. You started in the introduction. I love that the first couple sentences of the book in the introduction are about our company's 5-hour workday. So just that's so cool. But then the rest of the book, as you get into each chapter, it's a different element or aspect of design thinking. You're almost like teaching that format while you're slowly kind of unveiling your findings. So I love that. And perhaps that's like applicable for a business owner that's thinking, I'm going to use design thinking to implement a 4-day work week or a shorter work day. But I also think about it from a personal perspective. Like design thinking is kind of it's a mindset. And I wanted to talk about the book, The Distraction Addiction. In your book, one of my favorite studies that you referenced was the Ohio State researcher, Jessie Fox, and she had a focusing question. I'll let you elaborate on this, but she had a focusing question that said, what have you been wanting to do but feel you don't have time for?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, isn't that kind of could that be the key to the shorter workday? Like kind of unlocking, like what if we think about how we use our free time first before we attack the business case?
I think that's a great way of thinking about it. And more broadly, one of the things that I get from sort of Jessie's work after all these years, and that I see in the companies that I work with, is that it is really important in today's world to be intentional about our time. Whether this is the time we spend at work doing, deep work, or whether it's the time that we spend out on the hiking trail or the gym or the garden. That the world we live in today is one in which either our workplaces will, sort of expand to fill as much time in our calendars as we will allow. Or when we get off work, we have 1,001 different social media companies or services, et cetera, that are all competing to commoditize our time and sell it to advertisers. So, our attention is being competed for sort of across our days, and more than ever, we have to be thoughtful about how we spend our time and what we want to spend our time on. And I think that, but all too often, we don't ask the question that Jessie poses, right? If you had more free time, what would you actually do with it? And I think that, that asking yourself that question and having a clear answer for yourself can provide a powerful motivation for making the changes that will bring that within reach. And I think that especially given that what we're often talking about are relatively small behavioral or performance changes, either within the workplace or at home, right? Moving meetings from an hour long to 15 minutes isn't just one gigantic thing. It's a whole bunch of little things that you've got to do, and you've got to do consistently, and you've got to do with other people who are also willing to do it consistently. So when we embark on the challenge of shortening sort of our work days, it's exhausting because you're both having to focus a lot and you're having to do a whole bunch of work, right, to stay on track, right, to keep doing the things that you've got to do so that you can close your laptop at 2:00 or at the end of the day, Thursday, and say, I am done. I am out of here.
That's right. It takes a lot of intention.
It does. And having that big goal, knowing what you would do with that time, I think provides a great impetus for sort of exercising that intention and that discipline.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, Alex. When we were less than a year into our 5-hour workday experiment, Dave asked me, what's everyone using their free time for, more or less? I said, well, I know what I'm using my time for. Let's get everybody in a conference room and have a discussion about it. And what we discovered were there was a number of people that are like, I work from 8 to 1, take a late lunch, and then I just go home and sit on the couch for 3 hours and watch TV and then think about dinner. And then there were others that were very intentional, like, I've been wanting to do more surfing. I've been wanting to do more golfing. I've got a new gym routine. For me, I learned a new language. That's one of the questions. It's like, What have I been wanting to do? I want to learn a language, but I never had the time or the mental capacity. I felt like I had time to recover in the afternoon and then get into some language learning routines, spending more time with family. So sometimes people think, what do you want is kind of the heart of design thinking. Like, what is it that I want? But a lot of times, what do I want means there's more energy for me to give to other people, my family, more space. But going back to that findings from our conference room, the people that said that they were just watching TV, none of those guys are still with the company. And the people that were doing really interesting, cool stuff are still around and have done amazing, amazing stuff. So I thought that was interesting.
That is a great data point. That's really, really interesting.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit too about the future of work in general. Like, many people will introduce you as a futurist. So you probably get this all the time. Like, somehow you can see the future. They're like, so what stocks should I invest in? No. How do you see the 4-day work week, the shorter workday? How do you see this playing out over the next decade or so?
That's a great question. I was, in a way, heartened by what I saw in the pandemic with the 4-day week, which was, the pandemic would have been the perfect opportunity to say, we got to stop all these crazy experiments. It's time to pull back, get back to basics, right? Instead, what we saw was a flourishing of the 4-day work week. And what that told me was that there is a real sustained hunger to rethink the place of work on our lives, to rethink time, and to find new ways of working that allow us to do good work, to continue to serve our clients, to do stuff that often is really meaningful to us while still, without having it destroy us. I think over the coming decade that we will continue to see the movement expand, certainly with smaller organizations, with nonprofits. I think there will continue to be more experiments with governments. We've two of the countries that have implemented shorter work weeks for its public sector are Iceland and the United Arab Emirates. And you couldn't find, they're both relatively small, but you couldn't find two places that are more different, right? One place with a long tradition of deliberative democracy and everyone's in a union, versus a small country that is run very, very differently, that moves very fast. I think we're going to see more of that. We are seeing some big companies experiment, doing like a lot of little experiments with the 4-day week. So Medibank in Australia, which is an insurance company with about 4,000 people or so, they've got a lot of things going on at the individual retail store or department level. And they, I think, are pioneering the way that it's going to be implemented in big organizations, which is, start in a few places, study the heck out of it, gather as much data as you possibly can, mitigate the risks this way as well. So if something goes wrong, then it's just a couple of sites over here rather than the entire organization, and then scale it up. One of my big concerns, of course, is how artificial intelligence and particularly generative AI can affect all of this. And I think it really is going to come down to who gets to implement AI in the workplace. Because if it's outside consultants coming in and saying, we can reduce your headcount cost by 80% by firing people and having a bunch of AI agents, that is catnip to too many CEOs, right? Whereas if you give workers the ability to figure out, how can I use generative AI in the workplace? People don't automate themselves out of jobs. It turns out what they do is that they use the technology to, offload, outsource.
They become more productive. They become more valuable because they're using it as a tool, not as replacing their job.
They use it basically to climb up the value chain, right? So that they have more time for their most important, highest value added, and often most interesting work. And so I think that the places, and almost inevitably, when you're implementing AI that way, part of what you will discover is that you can use this to create free time that some places will give back to or share with workers in the form of a shorter work week. So I think that it is, you hear like Jensen Huang or Bill Gates talking about how AI is going, can enable a 4-day week. I think it's correct that it can enable, but it is not something that is sort of hardwired or inevitable. We have to take the benefits and think about how we're actually going to spend them rather than assuming that it's just going to kind of happen naturally. So I am cautiously optimistic that that will further accelerate the 4-day week. But I think that there are too many places doing it now for it to just kind of submerge beneath the surface and for people to sort of abandon it.
Do you know roughly how many companies do have reduced working hours while keeping pay the same?
I have a number, and I'm sure that it's wrong, precisely because I keep finding places that are doing it. So I think at this stage, it is, I know of something in the neighborhood of 1,000 or so, or of all over the world.
I mean, that's significant, especially since there's a mix of small and large organizations.
Small and large, lots of different kinds of industries. But I will say that, again, I keep finding new ones all the time, and new ones keep popping up. So it's
so cool.
Yeah.
So you interviewed just over 100 companies for your book Shorter, and now you're saying there's over 1,000.
Yeah. So
that's just exponential growth.
It is great. Yeah.
Now, do you think there will be a Ford Motor Company of the 4-day week or a shorter workday? Kind of, the story goes, Henry Ford announced that he would reduce hours to a 40-hour work week, and we're still on a 40-hour work week by default. Do you think there will be another Ford type mover that everyone follows?
I think it's possible. When you get into it, the challenges of moving to a 4-day week are no bigger than the challenges that organizations had moving to a 5-day week or a 40-hour work week. I think that they are a little different for for every company, but no place that knows its business, that has good people, and that is committed to sort of making a better and more sustainable workplace. For none of these is the 4-day week out of reach. And I've seen over and over again places that you wouldn't imagine could implement shorter weeks, like nursing homes, for example, where you have to have people on call available 24/7. These are places that have managed to implement shorter work weeks for sort of staff, and even while maintaining high levels of service. And I think if you can do it there, then you can do it absolutely anywhere.
Now, along these lines, obviously most of your research has been with 4 8-hour days, keeping pay the same. We're obviously biased to a shorter day because it's like we get the benefits of free time every single day as opposed to 1 day a week.
Right.
So why is the 4-day more popular than the reduced hour 5-day?
I think, first of all, 25 hours feels like that feels like not just an order of magnitude, but like, that's like sort of 5 sigma sort of more challenging for companies that have been doing, 40 plus hours.
What about 6 hours though? 6 hours is about the same number of hours.
There are some
as a 4-day.
Yeah, there are some organizations that have moved to that. I think that selling people on the idea of 3-day weekend is, that has a lot of appeal to it. It is a very, very clear goal. And however, I will say that when you look at, let's say, companies in the Netherlands or the Nordic countries that have shortened working hours or introduced flexibility, without going to 4-day work weeks, they move exactly in the direction that you're describing. Right? Partly because people have kid pickup needs or other kinds of things that mean that ending the day a little early rather than ending the week a little early works better in their own lives.
Absolutely. I'm a working parent, so my big case for the 5-hour or even a 6-hour workday, you could still more or less work school hours. And about 80%, well, there's a book called #Work School Hours from there's a lady from New Zealand, and she found that I think it said roughly 80% of workers will at some point be working parents.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very significant thing that people want to be able to work school hours. So maybe there's different seasons of life where the 5 or 6 hour workday become more attractive from that perspective. But also earlier, we also talked about peak mental performance.
Mm-hmm.
If we could work 4 hours, really intense, peak mental output, and then have an hour or two for admin and meetings, I mean, that to me, that's a recipe for success.
Yeah. And, what you hear in Dutch companies or Danish companies is that they sort of move in that direction, that their work days do become more intense when they get shorter. You leave some time for, time with clients, admin stuff, etc. And so you do end up in exactly the place that you just described. I think that there is, we don't have research yet that tells us over the long run whether 4-day work weeks are either more sustainable or better for people's health, et cetera, than 6-hour days. I suspect that that it will vary plenty depending upon whether you've got small kids, what else you've got going on in your life. But I am absolutely certain that the only bad shorter work week is the one that you don't implement.
Well said. Well said. And Alex, lastly, I want to ask you, what are you currently working on now? I mean, I know you referred to this as the unplanned trilogy. Is there another great piece of work that you're working on now, or what are you doing?
I have been focusing mainly on working with nonprofits to implement shorter work weeks, because they have some interesting challenges that I felt were sort of worth a deep dive. And I'm talking to my agent about what the next book will be. We haven't sold anything yet. And for me, the next book is whatever my agent is able to sell.
Too soon for that question. Sounds like you're doing some consulting and you're using all of your skill set and all of your research. You're using it to help businesses implement shorter work weeks, which is so cool. If this discussion resonates deeply with people and they want to dig into your work, how do you recommend they go about learning more about your work specifically?
Sure. So if you want to know more about the shorter work week, my organization is 4dayweek.studio. And I have recently launched a free version of the program that we ran with companies in the UK, the US, or all over the world to design shorter work week trials. There's been a lot of companies like Blue Street have written things about their experiences or published their own handbooks, policy documents, that sort of stuff. And so what I've done for that free course is gather all of that together as a kind of open source version of the class or the program that I have used in my own consulting.
Yeah. I think a lot of people would like access to that. And you said that can be found on your website.
Right. That's absolutely free. And then if after that you still want to, you want to talk further or talk about how we can do this within sort of your own organization, I'm always happy to talk about this at length. So
perfect. We'll provide the links in the show notes and get that out to folks if they ask.
Great.
I really appreciate it, Alex.
All right. Thanks a lot, Alex. This has been a
enjoyed
real
the
pleasure.
conversation.
Me too.
It was fun.